Okay, welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities here at SFU. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Humanities. People often wonder what the relationship is between these two units, and it's often easy to confuse the two. The Department of Humanities is a teaching unit. It offers a number of courses at the undergraduate level and graduate level, whereas the Institute for the Humanities is public-facing and, while connected to undergraduate and graduate education, it mainly puts on panel discussions, conferences, talks like this, and book launches and so on. So quite different units. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to Professor Newton Duarte's lecture entitled Education in Brazil, Beyond Neutrality and Indoctrination. Before I get to my introduction of Professor Duarte, I'd like to just acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I think it's especially important at this particular moment when there are ongoing struggles for the recognition of land rights and traditional governance structures of the Wet'suwet'en people in northern BC, that we acknowledge this. And in fact, I'd just like to take the liberty of reading a letter that we wrote at the Institute dated January 11th in support of the Wet'suwet'en peoples. So the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University recognizes that it exists on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Coast Salish territories, as I mentioned earlier, of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The Institute acknowledges that it is responsible to the beings, human and non-human, lands and waters of this region, and it strives to be an ally of their causes. We affirm the indigenous peoples as the true guardians of these territories, and from this understanding, we support the Wet'suwet'en people, their clan governance systems, and hereditary chiefs, and also condemn the actions of the Canadian government for violently interfering with the bodies of those defending the land and the people on this territory. The Canadian government, under the leadership of Justin Trudeau, has committed itself to an ongoing process of restoring relationships with Indigenous peoples, promising truth and reconciliation, as well as fulfilling its obligations under the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. Both UNDRIP and the TRC affirm the fundamental principle of free, prior, and informed consent, not just of elected band councils, which have jurisdiction only on reservations, but also of clans and hereditary chiefs. Therefore, with the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we call for the immediate withdrawal of the RCMP from Wet'suwet'en territory and support the right of these people to continue in their actions to protect the lands, waters, and futures of their people, and really all of us. We also call on other academic departments and institutions at SFU and beyond to join in condemning this state violence against Indigenous First Nations. So that's simply the letter that we drafted some time ago, almost 2 months ago now. I'd like to now introduce Professor Duarte. This is probably about the third talk or something that you've given here. Newton was here, I think, 2017.
September.
Yeah, to talk about some of the developments that were already afoot in Brazil in higher education and the education system as a whole prior to Bolsonaro coming to power. And I think with now this new regime, things have only accelerated in I think, quite a catastrophic direction. He is and has been now for several months a visiting scholar at the Institute. We've been very fortunate to have him. He spoke already a couple of months ago, November, about the situation in Brazil. And as I said, we'll be giving a seminar in exactly 1 week's time. So Professor Duarte is a Brazilian Marxist educator with more than 3 decades of engagement in a national movement named Historical Critical Pedagogy, which was inspired by the educational ideas of Antonio Gramsci and Lev Vygotsky, among others. As a visiting scholar here at the Institute, Newton is developing a study entitled Beyond the Choice Between Neutrality and Indoctrination, Epistemological and Ethical Foundations of the Democratic School. So please join me in welcoming Professor Duarte.
Before to start, briefly some few points. Firstly, this is my stay here since September to next June is financially supported by the university in which I work, as I'm receiving regularly my salary. The university is University of São Paulo State, we call UNESP. The campus is in Araraquara, and it's important to say that I have been supporting from my university, receiving my salary. The only problem is that I receive my salary in Brazilian currency, and here I pay in Canadian currency, but this is another problem, okay? Another financial support I received was from a public institution in São Paulo State, we call FAPESP. It was for 4 months, from November, December, January, and February. I had some additional financial support. And also I have to mention that my colleagues at the Department of Psychology of Education are responsible for my classes during the time I'm here, and I'm grateful to them because it would be impossible to be here without this kind of support. And also, of course, all the institutional support I have here at the Institute, from the Institute for the Humanities. Samir and Huyen, thank you very much for all your help, because we need, of course, institutional conditions to develop research, even theoretical, bibliographical research. We need institutional support conditions to be here, and all those helps are fundamental, indispensable for the study I'm conducting. Thank you for everyone, and thank you for you to be here to dialogue with me today. Well, as you know, the title of my presentation is Education in Brazil Beyond Neutrality and Indoctrination. I prepared some slides. It's not, I don't like to use slides in my lectures, but as English is not my first language, I prefer to use the slides just to be sure that my message will be received clearly. Yeah, I have to use. Should schools, teachers, curricula, and textbooks be neutral on issues of a political and moral nature? In Brazil, there is a movement called Non-Partisan School, in Portuguese, Escola Sem Partido, that besides arguing that school education should be politically and morally neutral, accuses teachers, especially those of public educational institutions, from kindergartens to universities, to be left-wing indoctrinators. Created in 2004 by a lawyer, Miguel Najib, this movement has employed the strategy of spreading a hostile climate for teachers who have been seen as a priori suspects of the intention of moral corruption of children and political indoctrination of young people. Currently, this detrimental view of teachers and public schools is incorporated into the political guidelines of municipal, state, and national governments. Now, this is official. One of the glaring inconsistencies of this ideological and moral war against teachers is the sharply indoctrinating nature of the discourses and practical measures that are supposed to aim to combat indoctrination in schools. Well, there is a paragraph. I don't put a paragraph in this slide. This obscurantist movement has no intention of making people rationally analyze the issues involved in Brazilian school education. The clear intention is to create prejudice, instill hatred, and instigate persecution. Despite the rhetorical argument that a neutral education is desired, free from leftist indoctrination, what is actually intended is the indoctrination in a culture that is a mixture of obscurantism and neoliberalism. This mixture is very important, obscurantism and neoliberalism. The soldiers of this war against teachers claim that they defend the neutrality of education to ensure freedom of thought, belief, and action for students and their parents. It turns out for them a neutral education is just an education purged of any trace of leftist ideologies. What are these left-wing ideologies and what are their traces found in school curricula, textbooks, and teaching activities? It is a question subject to the most arbitrary, irrational, and prejudiced interpretations. The study I am developing during this stay at the Institute for the Humanities does not aim to analyze the strategies and arguments used by these obscurantist movements to attack education. The critical analysis of the strategies and aims of this movement has been carried out in a detailed and rigorous manner by Brazilian researchers, and has already resulted in several publications, among which I mention 2 collections. The first, entitled Non-Partisan School, Escola Sem Partido, Sphinx That Threatens Education and Brazilian Society, published in 2017, edited by Professor Gaudêncio Frigoto. The second, entitled Democratic Education, Antidote to Non-Partisan School, published in 2018, edited by Professors Fernando Pena, Felipe Queiroz, and Gaudêncio Frigoto. You can say the difference between the 2 covers. One is what they intend, and the other is what we are trying to do. One of the ideological and psychological strategies that obscurantism employs is to intensify irrationalism. In order to oppose this strategy, I'm developing a theoretical analysis of ethical and epistemological foundations of democratic school. Obscurantism and neoliberalism cultivate contempt for theory, and there is a good reason for this attitude. As Bellamy Foster, 2019, has pointed out, capitalism has failed. In order to avoid the public awareness of this fact, is necessary an intense effort to maintain people imprisoned in their immediate everyday lives and their related pragmatical and superficial representations of reality. Oh, sorry. Critical thinking cannot adhere to this anti-theoretical attitude. On the contrary, it needs to develop consistent theoretical analysis that allow thought to break free from this environment of rationalism, utilitarianism, and immediacy cultivated by obscurantism and neoliberalism. Despite Brazilian teachers has been accused of leftist indoctrination by the obscurantists, and despite the obscurantists hypocritically wear the mask of neutrality, no effort is made by them to clarify what is meant by indoctrination and neutrality. A rigorous and critical analysis of these concepts can clarify important aspects that obscurantism has tried to keep out of focus. So, let's start by some questions. Should the democratic school take a stand against indoctrination? What is indoctrination, and what forms of indoctrination exist in contemporary society? Is neutrality an intrinsic quality to the democratic school? What is neutrality? It is possible, it is desirable. What are the limits of the discourses that defend neutrality and the attempts to put it into practice? In a society that intends to be democratic and plural, education needs to promote an attitude of respect for the diversity of values, political positions, and choices that each person makes in relation to their life. In other words, there is no democracy and plurality in society and education if freedom is not considered an unalienable principle. But wouldn't respect for plurality and freedom demand for the school the principle of neutrality? For example, in the case of Brazil, the Constitution establishes the separation between state and religion. That is the principle of secularism. This should mean that Brazilian public education was secular, that is, it adopted an attitude of neutrality in relation to the fact that students and their families adopt or not some religious belief. It turns out that the secularity of the state was never fully assumed in Brazil. In the preamble of the Brazilian Constitution, the expression "under the protection of God" is read. The use of this expression violates the principle of secularism because the Brazilian state puts itself in the position of defender of monotheism, disrespecting polytheistic beliefs and disrespecting atheists. In the case of the law that defines the basic norms of Brazilian education, the existence of religious education in schools is determined, although of an elective nature. However, the very definition in the law that religious education should be part of public schools violates, in my view, the principle of the secularity of the state and public education. Beyond the letter of the law, there are practices that also deny secularism. As you can see in this picture, on the wall of the meeting room of the Brazilian Supreme Court, there is a crucifix, which is a symbol of a particular religion. In Brazilian schools, independently of the official existence of religious education, there is a kind of unofficial religious indoctrination of children. Here there is a Brazilian journalist's account of what he has witnessed in several of our schools. It is an unofficial word, but very concrete. The pedagogical coordinator recommends to the mother that the messy child has God in his heart. Bible verses populate the school murals along with self-help phrases. The art teacher passes drawings of the evangelical aunt Esmilinguido to work on values with the class. The Catholic liturgy events are all celebrated, and the end-of-year event has speeches by priests and pastors. Rodrigo Ratier, November 25, 2019, last year. Regarding two explicitly political issues, the democratic education must respect the freedom of students and their families to choose to support this or that political trend, party, or candidate. The debates around issues of this nature, as you know, have been heated in recent years in Brazil as well as in other countries. As an example of a situation that occurred in another country, I mention an article signed by Valerie Strauss, published in the newspaper The Washington Post, October 16, 2016, with the title, "Teachers are expected to remain politically neutral. These teachers of the year say they can't." As part as part of the article, a letter signed by 10 teachers of the year is reproduced. These teachers, before the 2016 presidential elections in the United States, understood to be their ethical duty as educators to assume publicly their political position. They justify their attitude as follows. We are teachers. We teach children to become better writers, readers, scientists, mathematicians, and thinkers, so they can go on to live the lives they dream. We also help children become good human beings, to work hard, to do the right thing, and above all else, to be kind to one another. We are teachers. We are supposed to remain politically neutral. For valid reasons, we don't want to offend our students, colleagues, or community members. But there are times when silence is the voice of complicity. This year's presidential election is one such time. As teachers, we welcome all children into our classrooms, regardless of the color of their skin, how much money their parents make, or their religious beliefs. That notion of equality is at the heart of what it means to be an American. We believe that Donald Trump is a danger to our society in general and to our students in particular. His words and actions have shown a consistent disdain for human dignity. His behavior goes against everything we teach the children in our care. The concern of these teachers is clear in showing their respect for freedom and the diversity of positions, both in relation to their students as well as in relation to community members and fellow teachers. At the same time, however, they understand that there are times when neutrality is transformed into complicity, that is, times when neutrality is practically impossible, as silence already implies taking a position. This is an example of how the debate on neutrality of education can assume a strongly political and ethical connotation. Several other issues are connected to this analysis of neutrality and indoctrination in education. Freedom, as I mentioned above, the political and ethical relevance of the pursuit of truth. We are going to talk about this in the seminar. The relationship between objectivity and subjectivity of knowledge. Which kind of knowledge should be or should not be part of the school curricula? The conceptions of society, nature, and humanity implicit in any educational perspective. How to deal at school education with controversial issues, among others. While the analysis of the literature that I have been selecting for this study is in progress, I will present here only examples of some discussions on neutrality and indoctrination in education. John Kleinig, in an article published in 1976 entitled Principles of Neutrality in Education, states that the topic of neutrality is more complex than many advocates of neutrality in education seem to suspect. Quotation. My most general thesis will be that there is much work on neutrality still to be done, because much of what has been done is misconceived. It is misconceived first because neutralists have failed to make some necessary distinctions. Secondly, because they have argued too abstractly. And thirdly, because the appeal of neutrality is often a cover-up for other concerns. Kleinig argues that the issue of neutrality in education needs to be differentiated in relation to three levels. First, that of the policies that organize educational systems and decision-making on issues related to the educational purposes pursued by these systems. Second, that of school units. And third, that of teachers' activity. In relation to the teachers' activity, Kleinig disagrees with the thesis that when the teachers do not maintain a neutral attitude, they are necessarily indoctrinating their students. A related argument is that if teachers take a stand on matters about which informed and rational people disagree, they are likely to indoctrinate their students. The need for evidence is again critical, and the contrasts neutrality in indoctrination misleading. Indoctrination I take to be the passing on of beliefs such that They are no longer open to full rational assessment. This is not to be identified or even closely associated with the taking of a stand on matters on which informed and rational people disagree. This may be done in such a way that students are encouraged and equipped to assess them critically. In the absence of some additional argument, this, rather than neutrality, ought to be the direction in which teachers should move. Kleinig argues that it is not uncommon the occurrence of a selective attitude regards to the subjects on which the teacher's neutrality is advocated. This is very clear nowadays in Brazil. Just some issues are considered indoctrinating. In other words, in some subjects, the favorable positions on the part of the teachers are considered natural, whereas in other subjects, they are considered indoctrinating and harmful. Quotation. There are all sorts of issues on which teachers take a stand in class, but about which there is disagreement among informed and rational people. Yet so often it is only when the stands taken in class contravene the dominant ideology or the ideology of those in authority or power that the demand for neutrality is heard. Thus is often in the wake of the advocacy of unpopular views that neutrality is demanded. Think, for example, and remember the article is from 1976. Think, for example, how much of neutrality discussion is permeated by issues such as Vietnam, homosexuality, religion, and trade unions, and how little it has arising out of issues as competition, nationalism, marriage, and success, which are no less contentious, but generally advocated without a trace of self-consciousness. What I'm saying is this: principles of neutrality, if taken seriously, will swallow almost everything that goes into conventional schooling. Their limitation in practice to issues on which the dominant ideology or ideology of those in power might be threatened strikes me as morally perverse. It is perverse not only because of partiality in its employment, but also because authorities are notorious wrong on matter about which they feel strongly. The author does not seem inclined to agree that democratic school education and neutrality can be easily connected, both from a theoretical and a practical point of view. In the final paragraph of his article, Kleinig summarizes his position as follows. In sum, I have not wanted to oppose neutrality altogether, though I have been skeptical towards policies of neutrality. I have tried to show that, contrary to appearance, there is a great plurality of principles of neutrality, difficult to formulate in any satisfactory manner. Though I have not shown the impossibility of formulating and defending some general principles of neutrality, I hope I have indicated that if there are such, they will need a good deal more extensive qualifications than much of the literature on the subject generally leads us to believe. Jack Russell Weinstein, in an article published in 2004 entitled neutrality, pluralism, and education, civic education as learning about the other, criticize the association of liberalism with neutrality, and also criticize the idea that a liberal democratic education is neutral. In the case of civic education, Weinstein says that neutrality is impossible because it is necessary to teach, for example, that racism and sexism are attitudes that cannot be accepted. He argues that the teaching of prejudices or the non-confrontation of prejudices interferes in the process of political participation, since it limits the political participation of those who are targets of prejudice. In other words, in this case, neutrality is actually a political position. Weinstein argues that in a liberal democracy, individuals need to learn to position themselves on political alternatives, and therefore they need to learn to think about different. I forgot. And therefore they need to learn to think about different possibilities for the future of society. Quotation: instances of choice in which the agent is required to consent or reject the political order are innumerable. This is not mentioned, of course, the traditional modes of participation, such as electoral participation. As a consequence, citizens who are to be educated into a liberal state must be initiated into a life of choice, a life of rejecting and assenting to different possibilities. Civic education ought to be based on teaching critical thinking. It should cultivate that which is traditionally termed practical rationality, and educate towards the possibilities that students can understand, perhaps in some non-technical form, modal logic. Citizens need to be able to imagine possible worlds. They ought to be familiar with the possibilities inherent in the conditional and be able to ask themselves genuinely what the world would be like if they choose to reject or affirm any particular political ideology. Going a little further than the political philosophy of liberal democracy, it is worth asking whether contemporary society, organized under the premises of extensive and intensive commodification of all dimensions of social practice and human life, would be compatible with the very notion of democracy and, consequently, of democratic education. Is the neoliberal capitalism really committed with freedom and democracy, or its notion of freedom is limited to just one fetishized subject, the market? It would go beyond the limits of this study to carry out analysis on the relationships between political democracy and economic models. But the fact is that the very notion of democratic school education requires a discussion on themes that are situated in the field of relations between the state and the economy. Furthermore, Neoliberalism is not only a set neoliberalism is not only a set of principles about the political and economic functioning of society, but also encompasses conceptions about freedom, the relations between individual and society, knowledge, etc., as shown by Eamon Butler in his book entitled Hayek, His Contribution to the Political and Economical Thought of Our Time, published in 1985. Neoliberalism is, therefore, a worldview that influences education both in terms of educational policies and in terms of the purpose of education. And more than that, it is a worldview that impacts the very dynamics of people's daily lives in contemporary society. And in this sense, it also impacts school education, since school deal with people concretely inserted in social cultural relations produced or reproduced in everyday life. As an example, I mention the issue of relations between society and nature. This is an issue that can be addressed by various disciplines in school curricula. In addition to its multidisciplinary character, this topic can be approached from various angles and levels of analysis, from issues involving the human body, which is a synthesis of natural and social process, to issues related to living conditions across the planet, passing by the attitudes and decisions that individuals and groups take on a daily basis, as is the case of the problem of consumerism. Would be desirable a neutral attitude towards, for example, the practice of programmed obsolescence, which has such negative impacts in terms of the use of natural resources and the production of pollutants? But what would be the real power of influence of individuals and social groups in decisions on issues like this when the dominant ideology is neoliberalism, in which society must be regulated by the market? What is the margin of effective freedom that institutions and individuals have in a society in which the sphere of the economy is assumed as a field of human activity that enjoys autonomy and primacy in relation to other fields, such as political decisions, ethical evaluations, and scientific analysis? This example of the implications contained in the theme of the relations between society and nature highlights how important is the acquiring by the students of theoretical knowledge that overcomes the limits of the pragmatism prevailing in everyday activities. Using the terminology adopted by the Czech Marxist philosopher Karel Kozik, it is necessary the destruction of the world of pseudo-concrete. It is important to note, however, that the overcoming of pragmatism is not the adoption of a purely speculative attitude or the denial of the relevance of practical transformation of the world. It is about to construct forms of relationship with practice that are not limited to everyday utilitarianism and are not limited to the horizons of a reified present. Gandesha and Hartle, 2017, in the introduction to the collection The Spell of Capital, Reification and Spectacle, connect reification with the absence of the prospect of possible futures, in which the organization of society and life can be distinguished from the current status quo. Quotation. Reification seems to close off other possible futures. Reification thus seems to obstruct what Hannah Arendt considers the essence of the political, namely, the possibility of a new beginning, as opposed to the endless repetition of the same that she came, rightly or wrongly, to associate with the social, or the realm inhabited by what she calls animal laborance. The timeliness of our book can therefore seem The timeless of our book can therefore be seen in the manner in which it can contribute to an understanding of the closing of certain possibilities via the hypostatization of a market-based social-economic logic, neoliberalism, and the fake alternative between the hyper-capitalist and the fundamentalist spectacles. The overcoming of reified forms of relationship with social reality is not a process that takes place only in the level of subjectivity. It is a transformation of activities and, more broadly, of people's lives. In its turn, this transformation requires changes in the ways we see the world in which we live, and requires also ethical and political positions about the direction taken by social practices. There is therefore a complex interrelation between epistemological, ethical, and political issues in this debate on neutrality and indoctrination in education. The fact that a person makes explicit her ethical or political position about some issue is not by itself a process of indoctrination. There is indoctrination when people are manipulated in a way that blocks any questioning on ideas about society, nature, human life, etc. Indoctrination is a process of spreading dogmas and can be done imperceptibly to the individuals who are being indoctrinated. It can be done even in the name of freedom and democracy. This is the case of the current daily indoctrination by which people are induced to believe that there is no other possible and desirable form of social organization than the market-based society, that is, capitalism. People are not obliged to believe in this imprisoning social vision, but the neoliberal indoctrination impregnates people's minds so deeply that its denaturalization becomes arduous. Discussing a little more about neutrality, I would state that hypothetically it's possible certain level of neutrality in relation to specific issues. However, there is no possible neutrality in relation to the society we are part. In other words, it is not possible to be neutral about the fact that we live in a society dominated by the capital, even if by omission, ignorance, or deliberately non-political attitude. Someone does not take sides in this matter. That person, in doing so, is contributing to the maintenance of the status quo. Silence in relation to the fact that capitalism is not the natural and eternal form of social organization is therefore a form of indoctrination, which, however, presents itself as neutrality. To put it better, in the name of political neutrality in education, capitalism is not under discussion. This issue comes to be seen as a highly controversial issue in education. It's so controversial that paradoxically it sometimes becomes unanimous, since it is not even included in the list of controversial issues on which educators and society debate whether or not they should be present in school curricula. The analysis of neutrality and indoctrination in education necessarily leads to debates on controversial issues in education. There is also a significant literature in this field, and here I will briefly comment on just a few examples. One example is Lawrence Steinhause's 1970 article entitled Controversial Values Issues in the Classroom. It is a presentation given by the author at a conference on values and the curriculum. Within this broad theme of the conference, Steinhaus defined the specific theme of his presentation. I propose, quotation, I propose to address myself to a narrowly defined and strictly limited problem, though I hope you will agree, an important one. Certainly, it is a problem which is bound to be of central concern to any democracy, which emphasizes and values the responsibility of its citizens. This is the problem of handling within the curriculum areas of study involve highly controversial social, ethical, or political values. In short, how is a democracy to handle controversial issues in its school? The approach advocated by the author is that of total neutrality on the part of teachers when dealing in the classroom with controversial issues. For Steinhaus, teachers should aim to lead students to develop an understanding of controversial issues, to dialogue in a democratic, rational, and respectful way on these issues, and for this, the best didactic strategy would be the group discussion, grounded in research carried out by students in various sources of information. According to Steinhaus, the teacher's neutrality would not be limited to the attitude of not expose her personal position in relation to the controversial issue. It would be necessary, according to Steinhaus, to avoid transmission of knowledge. I repeat, to avoid transmission of knowledge from the teacher to the student as much as possible. At the end of the paper, the author extends the defense of this anti-teaching attitude to the entire school knowledge, what is coherent with his pedagogical and philosophical perspective, focused more on the form than on the content. This is a point I would like to emphasize, not only for Steinhaus in 1970, but for many educators to this day, teaching activity as a transmission of knowledge is seen as an act of indoctrination, therefore as something to be avoided as much as possible. For educators who share this perspective, the transmission of knowledge would be an impediment to the development by the students of intellectual and moral autonomy, critical thinking, and creativity. For 20 years, I have been criticizing this idea, which is central to a large group of right and left pedagogies, that I call learning to learn pedagogies. Unlike Steinhaus, Thomas E. Kelly, in an article published in 1986 entitled Discussing Controversial Issues: 4 Perspectives on the Teacher's Role, does not consider neutrality as the desirable attitude of the teacher towards controversial issues in classrooms. The 4 perspectives analyzed by Kelly are exclusive impartiality, exclusive partiality, neutral impartiality, and committed impartiality. It will not be possible to present here the analysis that the author makes of each of these perspectives. I just point out that he argues that the last one is the most desirable. Teachers can and should express their positions on controversial issues as long as they conduct the debate in a way that ensures that all perspectives are respectfully considered and rationally analyzed. In addition to theoretical analysis on neutrality or non-neutrality in education, there are also empirical studies that focus on educational realities in specific social, political, and cultural contexts. In this case, for example, this is the case, for example, of the article entitled Teaching Controversial Issues in a Fragile Democracy, Diffusing Deliberation in Israeli Primary Classrooms, published in 2018 by Itai Polak, Alisa Siegel, Adam Lefstein, and Asaf Mesrul. Here is the paper's abstract. Teaching truth, controversial, politically charged issues is promoted in Anglo-American democracies as a key means for cultivating active citizenry and democratic values. However, the challenges of discussing controversial issues in the classroom may differ in younger, deeply divided democracies that lack common ground and institutional stability. In this study, we ask what approach to the teaching of controversial issues do Israeli teachers adopt while enacting a curricular unit concerning Israel's founding fathers. The data were collected in an ethnographic study in 2 primary schools during the 2012-2013 school year. We use linguistic ethnographic methods to analyze the curricular materials and their enactment in 4 video-recorded lessons in 3 classrooms. We argue that while the curriculum addresses deeply controversial content, it is designed to inculcate a shared national ethos and therefore avoids controversy. In practice, teachers and students engaged with controversial issues, but in ways that diffused their volatility. We highlight two heretofore undocumented approaches to controversial issues. First, sidestepping controversy by stripping it of real-world complexities. And second, scholasticizing the discussion by focusing on literacy practices. Finally, we discuss the rationales for using these two approaches to diffuse controversy in the classroom and their limitations. It turns out that the list of controversial subjects depends to a large extent on the ideological struggle between conflicting worldviews, a struggle whose concrete configurations depend on the interests of the dominant class and the political groups in power. For example, in a scientific perspective, teaching the evolution of species would not in itself be a controversial subject. Also, from a strictly pragmatical point of view, there is no reason to consider this issue as a controversial one, since it has no immediate impact on people's lives. However, it becomes a controversial subject when religious groups in strong political power understand that teaching this school knowledge conflicts with the religious doctrine of creationism. The study of the factors that generate global warming should be considered an important content for the education of new generations, but it becomes a controversial subject because immediate economic and political interests are opposed to scientific evidence. The neoliberal view of knowledge is utilitarian and commodifying. In this view, the teacher is transformed into a mere technician who would help students to learn only what is useful from the point of view of adapting to the capitalist economy. In the sense that the non-partisan school, Escola Sem Partido, movement states that the task of the teacher should be limited to teaching school contents, while the task of educating has to be reserved to the family and, of course, the churches. This view tries to mutilate school education and, consequently, the teachers themselves by separating the act of teaching or instructing from the act of educating. However, as the act of teaching cannot be separated from the act of educating, and vice versa, what is actually happening is that the teacher is not really being forbidden to educate, but rather being forbidden to educate in another view than neoliberal obscurantist ideology. The construction of school curricula, textbooks, and didactic methods always involves educational decisions. It should be obvious that there isn't school education without education. It's not possible to teach any school knowledge and not educate in the same process. Another question is, how conscious are the teachers of the educative dimension of their teaching activities? But even when the teacher does not take this issue as an object of a deep and critical analysis, The fact is that he, she is educating the students by means the teaching of school contents. Of course, the desirable attitude is the development of a permanent critical evaluation of the worldview in which we are educating our students when we are teaching them the school knowledge. From the perspective of democratic education, teachers should not allow themselves to be trapped by the false choice between indoctrination or neutrality. By working to make children and young people to learn science, art, and philosophy in their richest and most developed forms, teachers will show their students that knowing the world is part of something bigger, which is the process of permanent transformation of the world and ourselves. The active resistance to neoliberal obscurantist indoctrination is inspired by the attitude of confidence in humanity's ability to construct a form of social organization that has as its highest ethical value the humanization of every individual. This implies equally that decisions about directions of society consider the consequences of what we do in the present for the near and distant future of life on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Newton. That was a wonderful talk, terrific overview, and a really important exposition of some of the key directions in which education is going. In fact, I just had a meeting with a couple of students before the session began, and they've invited me to come to their semester in dialogue. It's something that the SFU really has foregrounded as a key element of its attempt to be a foremost, publicly engaged university. And so I had a very nice chat with these students. I proposed the topic of free speech and expression, and so we were just talking about how things would look when I come to the class. So I'll spend 3 hours with the group and engage in dialogue. So I said, well, so what is dialogue? And what it came down to really was a highly managed, facilitated opportunity for people to engage in a very sort of horizontal way. There's nobody who comes into the classroom has any more knowledge than anybody else. And everybody gets to share their feelings and their stories and their truths. And I thought, very interesting understanding of dialogue, but in the humanities department we have a slightly different view of dialogue. It has more to do with Socrates and the idea of critical questioning, right? Socrates was very famous for asking his fellow Athenians questions that really annoyed them and irritated them, and probably contributed to Socrates' ultimate demise. His being charged with this is how it's understood, corrupting the minds of the youth and so on, and was given the choice between hemlock or exile, and he chose hemlock. But it became very clear that what dialogue is about form. There is no particular content there. We're not looking at the history of dialogue and how it has been shaped through theology and political philosophy, and later, sociology and literary studies and so on. It's very much a kind of approach that emphasizes that everybody's viewpoints are equally valid. And my question was precisely, it had to do with your example of climate change. I said, so the person who comes in and expresses as their truth that climate change isn't man-made. It has got nothing to do with humanities activities. It simply is, part of the nature of things, and there's nothing we can do about it. Versus those who are well-grounded in climate science and say, no, in fact, the 99% of scientists agree that climate change is produced by human activities and has been since the Industrial Revolution. And I think that this is precisely why these developments in educational theory and practice are really moving to create the conditions in which neoliberal social relations are simply reproduced. They're not creating conditions in which we can reflect critically on our condition and actually change them. So thank you very much. And so we have now about half an hour for questions and comments. I should also note as well that once we're finished here, we can take the discussion out into the hallway. There's a little reception. You can meet Newton and chat with him further there. So we shouldn't feel too constrained about the 30 minutes we have now, because we can continue in the hall. So. And I think what I'd prefer to do, if it's okay with you, is take maybe 3 questions at a time. Is that okay? 3 questions at a time?
Okay, if I remember the question.
Yeah, I'll try and help you. Okay. Well, maybe while people think about their questions and or comments. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear your comments on that. We've talked about this quite a bit, but it really does seem that there is a generalized kind of relativity or relativization, let's say, of truth claims. And you see this on both right and left. And I think that's a very important part of your talk, that the right wants to, in a sense, allow the traditional authorities to take over, the real work of teaching, and education really becomes a kind of training, a kind of way to ensure that people will be adept at the jobs that they're slotted into. Right? They'll be good workers. On the left, there's an increasing tendency towards identity politics. And the idea also, there's a kind of populism of the right, but there's also a kind of populism of the left that, we shouldn't listen to established authorities at all. Ideas of reason and rationality, these are the tools of the oppressor. They're not our tools. They can't be used to progressive purposes anymore. There's a real turning one's back on the tradition of the Enlightenment, and since Enlightenment is the opposite of obscurantism in a sense. Obscurantism is a process by which crucial ideas, crucial questions are kept in the shadows, kept under wraps. They're not available for public discussion and discourse. And Enlightenment is really the idea that everything should come before the court of reason, but the left has given up, it seems, on reason as much as the right has. So I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah. Well, we are going to discuss a little more about this on the seminar, but the problem with relativism is that, for example, about the global warming, in a relativist perspective, you have to accept any kind of view equally, and you have no criteria to compare and to discuss what is a knowledge that explains better the reality, the social and natural reality, and the relation between the social and the natural. And because the relativism, in my interpretation, makes a mistake. They take right the point of departure, but they make a wrong conclusion. There is no absolute knowledge. Okay? Knowledge is never absolute. Knowledge is in process. Knowledge is not perfect. And humankind develop ways and types of ways to know the reality, methods, types of knowledge, and our knowledge is permanently in transformation. We are trying to understand what reality is and what reality could and can be. The process, the possibilities inherent in the real. In this way, knowledge is not, of course, perfect, is not definitive, is not absolute, but we can say that this knowledge is better than this. That one kind of knowledge explains better the reality. And one kind of knowledge can help us to transform the reality and to transform ourselves in a better way. And the problem with relativism is that because there is no absolute knowledge, they conclude that all kinds of knowledge are equally right or wrong.
I think I have a slightly different view. And that has to do with the fact that what you've just described there, the absence of absolute knowledge, the idea of its fallibility, so what we know now might be overturned by further findings and so on. We know that because this is what's happened and led us here. So we have to infer from that the possibility that our knowledge now will also be revised, rejected, as we conduct more experiments or have better theoretical models and so on, right? So that's skepticism, and that skepticism is built into the scientific enterprise. But science itself isn't relativistic, is it? I mean, it does claim that certain kinds of truth claims are of a different order because they are based in the skeptical frame of mind, which requires evidence, which requires repeated testing, falsifiability, as Popper would say. I think that what's happening today is a kind of overinflation of skepticism, right? So skepticism plays a role within science, but now skepticism is overtaking science, or it has become so inflated so as to question the scientific enterprise, into question, to call into question the scientific enterprise. And some of those developments have to do with post-colonialism, postmodernism, the idea of the idea that science as a project is fundamentally connecting power and knowledge, and it's about Western hegemony and so on. Yeah. It has been that, and it is that, but it's not just that, right? And I think that those same people making those critiques do rely upon Western medicine, and they do rely upon now public health. They do rely upon the idea that we can't see viruses. We have to assume for various reasons that they exist, and they can do us real harm. So we need to take particular measures, like washing our hands and all this. I mean, with the coronavirus, this is very much at issue. So I think it's more the place of skepticism in the enterprise of of knowledge production.
Yeah, and from the neoliberal perspective, the good knowledge is just the knowledge that helps to make money.
That's right.
Just this.
Yeah.
Then it's just a practical, immediate knowledge with economic consequences, immediate economic consequences. Yeah. And they are different perspectives, but the result is more or less the same.
There was a time, I don't know if people remember, and please feel free to raise your hands and I'll recognize you. Yeah, sure. We have a microphone. I'll come to just in 1 second, but maybe about 9 years ago now, the previous Harper government announced that there would be no more funding for basic research. Right? All scientific research had to be applied, so economically useful, but basic research was no longer going to be funded, which is very interesting. Yeah, please.
Well, just going back a little bit to the presentation,
okay.
And of course the Brazilian context, in terms of the changes that were made throughout these, I would say, 5 to 10 years to the educational policies in the country. Because I saw in your presentation that there was, well, of course, there's a clear discussion on the impact of the neoliberal agenda on the educational policies in the country. Not just in Brazil, of course. This is something that is going on for decades, and this is around the world. But it's interesting to notice as well that I remember when I was living in Brazil, that was like over, I don't know, 12 years ago. It was interesting for me to notice that the left-wing government that we had in the country was also promoting certain neoliberal changes in the country, right?
Okay.
Of course, not to the extreme that we see nowadays. I'm not comparing in the sense of, you know, we're talking about certain forces, I guess, pushing the government or forcing the government also to implement certain changes in response to what was going on in other parts of the world. And that we, in the humanities, we also criticize the left-wing governments for their neoliberal agenda. So this is something that just came to mind as I was watching your presentation. The fact that the neoliberal element has been present in Brazil, I would say, for the past 15 or more years, of course. As far as I remember, as a student in Brazil, I studied sociology at Unicamp in Brazil. And I have a degree in education as well from Unicamp as well. Anyways, and another element that I thought of as I was listening to your talk, to your presentation, thank you very much for the presentation, by the way, was also the whole, as part of this neoliberal obscurantist indoctrination that was mentioned, the whole also silence, or I would say the repression about the discussion of gender in the school system, right? Yeah. So this crusade that was first headed by the Catholic Church, but then taken on by the evangelical Christians in the country, about reading all the educational policies on the municipal level, state level, the federal level of the word gender. So gender should not be a topic to be discussed, apparently to protect children from whatever they think that they need to be protected from. But of course, in a way, it's just, and of course, in defense of the traditional family values in the country. So I just, in summary, I would like, if possible, that if you could speak a little bit about also this, the thing about the gender ideology, the way that there's this silence about homophobia, about bullying, and about certain issues concerning human sexuality in the school system in Brazil, and also the impact, the different impact of neoliberalism but has been impacting the country even within left-wing governments.
Okay.
Right? Thank you.
Can I just quickly add to that, just to make the point even, I think, stronger? You probably remember when Judith Butler came to Brazil a couple of years ago. Judith Butler is this very famous Judith Butler. She's a very famous gender
Ah,
theorist,
okay,
right?
okay,
of
okay.
Gender as a form of performativity. She was quite viciously attacked.
Yeah.
She was in a car and the people were banging on it, and they had her in effigy, and they burnt her in effigy because this was seen as a real threat to traditional gender roles and so on. So I think this really brings that home. Yeah, my friend actually invited her. But they don't know actually how conservative her politics actually are, so I don't know if there was such a problem. No, sorry. But they're kind of conservative. Kamala Harris supporter. So,
Can I just add another thing?
sure.
One second.
Thank you, Newton, also for your lecture. And what's your name? Sorry. Renato. So Renato talked a little about the evangelic Christians in Brazil, and I was all the time thinking about that. Because I don't know if you are familiar with that, but they really believe that there is something like evil and devils. They talk more about devils in their churches than of God. So it was easy for them to relate that to the left wing, or Judith Butler. She was burned. Their image was burned as a witch. And also all the left wing candidates and politicians were also in the same spectrum for them. For example, Lula, that is the former president, one of the former presidents, he was also burned in some manifestations, some public manifestations, as a devil, or his image appears as something evil. So this is something that we cannot lose sight of, especially because we are talking about a war that is going on, and this is very hypocritical to say that we are talking about Escola Sem Partido. It's just a war that is going on for the minds of this young generation. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. So, do we have a third question or comment? No. Okay, then you can.
Okay. Yeah. Firstly, about neoliberalism in leftist governments. Well, neoliberalism in Brazil, in my point of view, it arrived in Brazil at the end of the 80s with Fernando Collor de Mello, our first presidential election after the dictatorship. And as you know, Brazilian people here know, he was totally produced by the media as a kind of fighter, hunter. He was a kind of hunter, and he was hunting the privileged public servants that the Brazilian problem, the problem of the Brazilian state would be the big salaries, people so privileged, and this governor of a Brazilian state in Northeast was a kind of new politician, hunting all these bad servants in Brazil. Well, but his style in politics and his personal life and relations at that time were not good, my interpretation, for the ruling class, the business, not good for business. More or less the same that is going now in Brazil, because the political situation is really unstable now. This is not good for business. Well, after this, we had some years with the vice president, Itamar Franco, and after Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was the author of the economic plan real, the real neoliberal economic policy in Brazil since the 90s, and during Lula's governments and Dilma also, the PT governments, the economic policies didn't change too much. That's the point. Of course, there were some good social actions and programs and so, but at the level of economic policies, the neoliberalism, yeah, because this is part of the neoliberal ideology, the autonomy of economy. Economy for neoliberal ideology is autonomy, and you can play democracy if you want, but economics is economics.
Yeah, Wolfgang Schäuble, who was I think the finance minister of Merkel's government when they were negotiating with Greece, and Greece had the referendum. He said election results, referendum results, cannot be permitted to interfere with economic policy.
Yeah. This is not in Brazil. For example, in Chile was the same. They fight against the dictatorship, but the governments, the democratic governments after the dictatorship, they also adopted the neoliberal economic policies, and that's why the situation now is that way in Chile. About gender at schools and all this war against this issue, not against the issue, against people, yes. Against people, yes. Okay? In my talk here in September 2017, I used the expression belligerent obscurantism, belligerent. This is important. It's this kind of world view is belligerent. That's why it's not so distant of fascism, because fascism also is belligerent. Of course, nowadays, this belligerent obscurantism uses new ways, new practices, new strategies. We have technology, and we have war against people on the social media and so. But this is a very strong point for this war against teachers, against a huge part of our society. You are not going to discuss sexual education, gender, anything like this. This is prohibit. This is a dictatorship. Of course, they have the right to be conservative. They have the right to defend a conservative view of family, of sexuality, and so on. But they have no right to impose this conservative view of life to the entire Brazilian population, to the new generations. That is not, they say that are defending neutrality, but there is no neutrality. It's pure indoctrination. Indoctrination of these belligerent, obscurantist, and neoliberal worldview. And if you see all the ministers of this government in Brazil now, they share the same view of society, life, everything. One minister of the dictatorship, Delfim Neto, told in an interview, I think it was last year, that in this government there is a bright side and a dark side. The bright would be the Minister of Economy, and the dark side would be the president, all those around the president. But there is no bright side in this government. There is no bright side at all. The neoliberalism is not the bright side of this obscurantist worldview. It's just the other side of the same coin. Sorry. And, yes, it is part of this obscurantist view of society and life, a totally strange, in my opinion, view of Christianity. Because when I was young, I was Christian, and I studied the Bible and so deeply. And I can't see Christianity in this belligerent view, plenty of hatred of the other. Of course, as a Marxist, I have to see the history. And the history of Christianity is not a very good history. A lot of wars, persecutions, and so. But, yeah, genocides and so. But when we just see the message of Christ in the Bible, it's not this kind of worldview full of hatred and so. And it's a strange kind of Christianity, and this is really part of this obscurantist view of society. And it is horrible, horrible. People can't say anything on social media, in public spaces, even in family meetings, because you are afraid of a very aggressive reaction, persecution. People are leaving the country because they are being persecuted.
Well, first, I'd like to thank Professor Duarte for his presentation. And, well, it's interesting how neoliberal agenda navigates between left and right governments, as Renato mentioned. And I'd like actually to talk about two topics. I've been discussing indoctrination and neutrality for some time. That's, for this time I've been doing my PhD and UBC. And what it really gets to me is that, well, curriculum options or whatever option education is always political, is always intentional. So how can we just not dismiss, but maybe change the conceptualization of what indoctrination is? Because in a sense, we are always teaching for something. Maybe Some teachers are teaching for neoliberal reasoning, some teachers are teaching for social justice, but we're always teaching for something. So this word indoctrination is kind of a nonsense word in this, because we're always teaching intentionally, right, with an intention. So the first question is, how do we deal with a word that I think, in my opinion, should be not disregarded, but deep and discussed in a sense that we should state that education is politically intentioned always. It's hard to detach this negative sense of the word indoctrination, because nobody wants your kids to be indoctrinated, right? I think everyone would agree on that, but in the same sense, in the same way of thinking, we should regard education as a political enterprise. And the second one is, well, some North American authors, scholars, as Michael Apple, they would say that this neoliberal alliance with fundamentalist evangelicals and neoconservatives would take place in schools, and that religion would play an essential role in that. And I think in Brazil that's something very important. I think religion has always been playing a very important role in Brazilian democracy since always. And one question I'd like to ask you is if you think that the lack of discussion about religion in schools, because, well, religion has always been present in schools, but in a very indoctrinating way, as you said. Yeah. And I think that within leftist government, religion has always been, let's not talk about it because we're a secular state, so let's not talk about religion because we're secular. But by not talking about it, we can also create a problem that nobody discusses religion, and if religion is not in school and a topic that we can't discuss in school, then it's also, it can also create a big problem, and I think it has created already a big problem. So I would like you to talk a little bit about how you think religion play a part on it.
Great. So we'll have one more question here, and then the response, and then we'll go to the reception. We can keep discussing.
I think my question is connected to your first question. So I'm just wondering how teachers are teaching in Brazil, if they are not aligned with this idea of being neutral, because I agree that we are never neutral. At least this is our discourse in early childhood education. So we think that we are never neutral, and we are always engaging in politics when we educate, and when we teach students, or when we are interacting with children. So I'm wondering how teachers are teaching in Brazil if they don't agree in these ideas of neutrality and obscurantism. So how are they doing?
Yeah. About the concept of indoctrination, as I said, my work is in progress, and I'm analyzing articles, chapters, books, and there is a very interesting literature about the concept of indoctrination, and some authors like you, they defend that this concept makes no sense. We should just forget about indoctrination. Others, they discuss different meanings, the different concepts of indoctrination. Well, at this point of my analysis, what I can say is I disagree with the identification of teaching and indoctrinating. Teaching, I see teaching as transmission of knowledge. Many educators don't like they use this word transmission, but in my view, we work with knowledge, we transmit knowledge, and also I use the concept reproduction of knowledge, cultural reproduction, in a dialectical understanding. I don't see reproduction just the the repetition of the same. My understanding of reproduction is a process, a dialectical process in which there is, at the same time, conservation and transformation. We conserve, we preserve, and we transform knowledge. And I understand teaching as a transmission of knowledge which doesn't conflict with the notion, for example, of dialogue. Because some educators think that in order to promote dialogue, we would have to go against teaching, and they understand teaching as the same of indoctrination. For me, indoctrination, as I said, I'm working on the studies of all the analysis of this concept, but at this point of my analysis, I see indoctrination as I put in my presentation, as a spreading of dogmas, as a process that blocks the questioning of certain view. This is, for me, indoctrination. It's not the same that take a stand in about some issue, and it's not the same that educate, that transmit knowledge to the children. About children and young people. About religion. People prefer not to discuss religion in the academic circles, in educational circles in Brazil. People, the right people, they discuss religion because they are religious, and they defend a very conservative religious view of the life, and for them education and religion is more or less the same, as for them is the same if we talk about moral values. For them it's synonymous to talk about moral values and religious values, the same. But people from the left, they are a little uncomfortable discussing religious. They prefer not to discuss. And I disagree with this position. I think we have to discuss religion. Seriously, respectfully, but we have to discuss. And the other, how teachers are teaching now in Brazil. Well, it's a very, very difficult situation now. Of course, teachers don't see the same way what is going on in Brazil. Some teachers are conservative, very conservative. And they think that, well, Brazil now is better. No, those communists around the schools, and so Brazil is better now. And Brazil now is more traditional, and so there are teachers who think and see the world and life in this way. But for many teachers, the situation now is really, really hard, because the fear is spread. I don't know if there is someone here with a cell phone making a video in order to put it in a website denouncing that, Professor Newton, he is a leftist indoctrinator. Well, everyone knows about that because I'm a Marxist, you know. it's supposed, I suppose to be, in their view, of course, I'm indoctrinator. I'm leftist indoctrinator. They see in this way. All Marxists are indoctrinators. But imagine...
Is anybody here secretly filming?
But yeah, if I'm a teacher of geography, or literature, I'm afraid if this author, this book, this issue will be considered leftist indoctrination, if I will be persecuted, the situation is really, really hard. And besides that, the neoliberal reforms that are cutting off all the rights of the teachers. This, the day before yesterday, in São Paulo State, the people, the teachers, they suffered violence from the police because they are just in a manifestation against reform about pension, because we are losing our pensions. We are losing, losing the right of retirement. Yeah, you are going to teach forever until you die, and well, it's not really a good choice nowadays in Brazil to be a teacher. Yeah.
So we should draw some connections, and just to sort of now wrap up, and we're going to have reception. Just to draw some connections, what happened here a few years back under the previous Liberal government in British Columbia, it was revealed through leaked documents that the government's actual approach, their intention was to create a crisis in public education, so primary and secondary education, public school system, to create a crisis by overwhelming classroom sizes, reduction in special aid, special needs assistance, and so on. They knew that would cause a response from the Teachers Federation, and they thought then this would be to their advantage. The crisis would be blamed on the teachers, but it went very badly for the government, and I think it was a Supreme Court decision that led to the BC government's being mandated to reduce class sizes and to restore funding to schools and so on. It was really a concerted attack on the teaching profession. So that happened a while back. I think the situation has improved considerably. 2 days ago, though, at a different level of education, the university in California, people might have heard about this, University of California, Santa Cruz, one of the most progressive universities in the United States, probably in the world. I think 53 teaching assistants were fired because they went out on strike, trying to get better wages and benefits. So there has been an all-out attack under neoliberalism on teachers, on educators, professors, but there's also been a lot of fight back. In the United States, many teaching unions have mounted real forceful responses and gained some ground, and many of these teachers, most of these teachers, I think, are really behind Bernie Sanders. So this is quite an interesting development. So,
let me say just some final words about this. For many years, I have been defending that school and the teacher's work is something really important for the struggles to change the society, to construct a better society. And I never accepted some analysis from my colleagues from the left perspective about school, the analysis in which school is seen as some essentially alienated and alienating institution and teachers. They will be the agents of this alienation.
This is what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatus.
Yeah.
Schools
And I ever had this question. Well, if a school is so alienating, if the teachers are agents of alienation, why the bourgeoisie fights so strongly against public schools and public teachers? Something is wrong in this equation. Something is wrong. And I think, in an opposite way, that school is a kind of socialist institution. But it's a kind of socialist institution in itself. That means we need to develop the potential of this institution of socialization of knowledge. If we develop this potential, school education can be really dangerous for the interests of the dominant class. I'm not denying all the alienation that school education has been reproducing since it exists. I'm not denying this. But what I'm saying that why teachers are considered the enemies of society in a capitalist society. Something is wrong when our leftist educators says that the curricula are alienating, school is an alienating institution, and teachers are agents of alienation. I think we need more dialectics to analyze this process. And I agree with you, there is resistance. In Brazil, there is resistance. I don't know for how much time we will have energy to resist to these tremendous attacks we are suffering now. But we are resisting.
Well, on that note, Newton, thank you so much for your great talk. And thank you all for coming and for your questions and comments. And we'll see you outside for some food.
And we can talk in Portuguese.
Yeah, definitely.